The kitchen clock read 5:37 in the morning, and Valentina was already up, preparing breakfast for Miguel. The little boy, only 5 years old, was still asleep, snuggled under a thin blanket on the small sofa in the living room. The apartment was simple, modest, but impeccably tidy. Valentina was the kind of woman who would do whatever it took to ensure that her son had the best, even if that often meant sacrificing her own comfort. But that morning, something was different. There was a weight on her shoulders, an anxiety burning in her chest. Today would be her first day in a completely unexpected job. She would be taking care of Gabriel Montero, a millionaire businessman who, after a tragic accident, had become paraplegic. The offer had come from Dona Beatriz, an elderly neighbor who knew someone who worked at Gabriel's mansion. "The salary is great, my dear. You can't turn down this opportunity," Beatriz had said excitedly. And Valentina knew she was right. The money would be enough to pay the overdue bills, put food on the table, and maybe even buy Miguel a new mattress. Still, she couldn't ignore the rumors about Gabriel. They said he was an arrogant, unbearable man who no one could work with for long. Ever since the accident, he had pushed everyone around him away, locking himself away in his own solitude. As she took a sip of her now cold coffee, Valentina sighed. What could a man like him have been through to become so bitter? A little later, she put on her best clothes, a simple blouse, jeans, and a coat that had seen better days, and left Miguel with the neighbor. "Mommy, come back soon, okay?" she said, kissing his forehead. The boy nodded, half asleep, and smiled. "Good luck, Mommy." With a heavy heart and her hands sweating cold, she took the bus to the address indicated. The upscale neighborhood where Gabriel lived seemed like another world. Wide streets, imposing houses, and luxury cars parked on the sidewalks. Finally, she stopped in front of the huge iron gate of a modern mansion, surrounded by a huge, well-kept garden. Before she could ring the bell, the gate opened automatically, as if someone had already been waiting for her. Could he be as terrible as they said? Upon entering, she was greeted by Andre, the butler. He quickly analyzed her and said in a neutral tone, "Mr. Gabriel is in the office. He has already been informed of your arrival." Valentina's nervousness increased. She followed Andre through the wide corridors of the house, decorated in an elegant and minimalist style. Each step echoed on the marble floor. When they stopped in front of a dark wooden door, Andre knocked lightly and announced, "Sir, your new caretaker has arrived." A heavy silence filled the room before a firm, cold voice echoed from inside the room. "Let him in." Valentina swallowed hard and pushed the door open. Behind a large wooden desk, in front of a window that offered a spectacular view of the city, sat Gabriel Montero. His eyes were sharp as razors, and his expression carried a mixture of contempt and weariness. He was sitting in his wheelchair, arms crossed, observing her with a critical gaze. "So, you're the youngest one who came to try to put up with me?" he said, with a slight tone of irony. "How long do you think it will last?" Valentina felt a chill down her spine. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't willing to give up so quickly. "As long as it takes," she answered firmly, keeping her gaze fixed on his. A slight flash of surprise passed through Gabriel's eyes, but he soon regained his coolness. "We'll see." And so, without knowing it, the two of them were about to begin a journey that would change their lives forever. The silence between Valentina and Gabriel seemed to stretch time inside that large, cold office. The man before her wasn't just arrogant. He overflowed with a bitterness that seemed glued to his skin. His dark eyes analyzed her, as if he already knew exactly who she was, without even knowing her. "Well, since you're here, I hope you understand something," Gabriel began, turning his wheelchair slightly and moving away from the table. "I didn't ask for a caregiver. I don't need help. And honestly, I doubt you'll last more than a week." Valentina crossed her arms, keeping calm. She had heard this speech before. At her last job, at a clinic, many patients in rehab also rejected any attempt at assistance. But there was always a reason behind the resistance. "I didn't come here because you asked me to," she replied, unfazed. "But because there's a signed contract, and this job will help me support my son. So if you don't like my presence, That's your problem. I'm here to do my job. Gabriel's eyes flashed with a mixture of irritation and something that bordered on amusement. He hadn't expected her to have the courage to responding like that. Interesting, she murmured, tilting her head. Most people try to please me or pretend to be patient. Not you. Because I'm not here to please you, Mr. Montero, Valentina replied, keeping her gaze steady. Gabriel was silent for a few seconds. Then, as if he had lost interest, he turned his chair around and went back to the window. Andre will show you where the room I prepared for you is. If you want to give up before the first week is over, the door is over there, he said, nodding toward the exit. Valentina simply nodded and left the office without looking back. The mansion was silent. Valentina took the opportunity to explore the environment a little while familiarizing herself with her new responsibilities. The butler Andre, a discreet and efficient middle-aged man, explained some basic rules of the house. Mr. Gabriel has strict schedules. Breakfast at 8, lunch at 1, and dinner at 7. But he eats alone in his room. He doesn't like to be disturbed. Has he always been like this? Valentina asked curiously. Andre hesitated for a moment before answering. No. Before the accident, he was different. She realized that the butler didn't want to go into the matter further, so she didn't insist. But she was intrigued. What had happened to Gabriel Montero besides the accident? It was already past 10 at night when Valentina went to Gabriel's room to see if he needed anything. The door was ajar, and before knocking, she heard a strange noise. Curious, she discreetly peeked through the crack. Gabriel was alone, sitting near the window, holding a glass of whiskey. The dim light from the lamp highlighted the shadow on his face, and his eyes seemed empty, fixed on an undefined point on the horizon. On the small table next to him, there was a photograph face down. Valentina felt a tightness in her chest. For the first time, she saw something beyond Gabriel's coldness and arrogance. She saw a broken man. But who had broken his heart like that? The sun had barely risen when Valentina discreetly entered Gabriel's room. She found him exactly as he had been the night before, sitting by the window, but now with his eyes closed and an empty glass beside him. He seemed to have spent the night there, without bothering to go to bed. She sighed. That mansion, so luxurious on the outside, hid a man trapped in his own pain. Mr. Montero, she called, knocking lightly on the door. Gabriel opened his eyes slowly, as if the simple act of waking up was a weight on his shoulders. What is it? He grumbled impatiently. It's 7:30. Your coffee will be ready soon, she said, ignoring his hostile tone. And I also scheduled your first physical therapy session for today. He snorted and looked away. Cancel it. I can't. Your doctor recommended daily sessions. Gabriel turned to face her, his eyes shining with irritation. I don't need physical therapy. Valentina crossed her arms. Yes, you do. And you're going to do it. He laughed, a bitter, almost defiant laugh. Do you think you can force me? She took a step forward without looking away. I can't force you to do anything, Mr. Montero. But if you're content to live in that chair for the rest of your life, ignoring any chance of improvement, then the problem isn't physical. It's mental. Silence weighed heavily between them. Gabriel hadn't expected that answer. Who do you think you are to talk to me like that? Your caregiver. And if I have to be the only person in this house who will tell you the truth, then I will. Gabriel clenched his fists on the wheelchair's handles. He wasn't used to being challenged. Ever since the accident, the few people who were around him only said what he wanted to hear. But Valentina wasn't afraid of him, and that bothered him more than he would like to admit. The room was spacious and well-equipped. Valentina and the physiotherapist, Dr. Renato, were waiting for Gabriel, who, as expected, made a point of being late. When he finally arrived, his expression was a mix of boredom and impatience. Let's get on with it, he said, without enthusiasm. The physiotherapist remained calm. Today we're going to start with simple exercises, Gabriel. We need to get your body used to movement again. The businessman didn't answer. He just watched as the doctor explained the procedures. When Renato held his legs to start the muscle stimulation, Gabriel gritted his teeth. Do you feel anything? The physiotherapist asked. Nothing, he answered dryly. Valentina watched everything in silence. She knew Gabriel wanted to give up, but there was something in his eyes that showed he was still fighting, even if it was against himself. After a few minutes, Renato ended the session and wrote down his observations. Let's continue with this every day. Don't give up, Gabriel. Small advances make all the difference. Gabriel didn't answer. He just turned his chair around and left the room. But Valentina saw him. For a brief moment. Second, he closed his eyes and let out a long sigh, as if he was tired of fighting himself. And maybe he was. Valentina found Gabriel on the mansion's porch that night. The cold wind swayed the curtains, and he, with a lost look, held a glass of whiskey as if that were the only thing he had left. But Valentina already knew that the problem wasn't the drink. The problem was everything he kept inside himself. She approached slowly. "You don't have to run away from me, Mr. Montero," she said, leaning against the doorframe. Gabriel laughed softly, without humor. "Run away? Do you think I'm running away?" "I think you're hiding from something much worse," she replied directly. He turned his face to look at her. There was a glint of challenge in his eyes, but also something deeper, something broken. "And what makes you think you know so much about me?" Valentina sighed. She didn't know everything, but she knew how to recognize when someone was lost in their own pain. "You don't have to tell me anything, but if you want to talk, I can listen," he said, taking a step back. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then Gabriel let out a long sigh and looked at the illuminated city ahead. "I was going to get married." Valentina remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "Lorena and I had been together for 3 years. I thought she was the love of my life. I was a businessman, always busy, but I did everything to make up for it. Trips, gifts, dinners in expensive restaurants. I believed that was enough." He paused, twirling the glass between his fingers. But then the accident happened, and everything changed. Valentina felt a tightness in her chest. She already knew what he was going to say next. "I was in the hospital, fresh out of surgery. The doctor said I might never walk again. She showed up there. I was relieved to see her. I thought she would stay by my side." He let out a bitter laugh. "But do you know what she did? She took the ring off her finger, placed it on the table, and said she couldn't be with a man who wasn't complete." Valentina felt a lump in her throat. "Did she abandon you?" Gabriel gripped the glass so tightly it felt like it was going to break. "Yes, and that wasn't all. When I got out of the hospital, I found out she was already with someone else. A friend of mine." Valentina closed her eyes for a moment. Now she understood why he had closed himself off from the world. It wasn't just the accident. It was the betrayal. "I'm sorry," she said sincerely. Gabriel glanced at her sideways. "You don't have to feel anything. It doesn't change what happened." Valentina hesitated before answering. "No, it doesn't. But you can decide what to do with it." He arched an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She gave him a small smile. "You can continue to be stuck with what Lorena did, or you can prove to yourself that you still have a life to live." Gabriel didn't answer. He just stared at the city, lost in thought. But Valentina saw something different in him. For the first time, it seemed like he was considering the possibility of moving on. The next morning, Valentina found Gabriel in the same place she had left him the night before, sitting on the porch, looking lost. But something was different. He wasn't holding a glass of whiskey, and his face, though still serious, seemed less somber. She stopped at the door and crossed her arms. "I thought I was going to have to drag you to physical therapy again today," she teased. Gabriel sighed and rubbed his temples. "Don't get used to it," he muttered. "But I think I'll try again." Valentina suppressed a smile. He wouldn't admit it any time soon, but he was already changing. Dr. Renato was pleased. "Your progress is a little better today, Gabriel. Do you feel anything different?" The businessman hesitated. "No, but—" He paused, seeming to choose his words. "I don't feel as frustrated as I used to." Renato smiled. "That's a big step forward." Valentina was watching everything closely. She had already noticed small changes in Gabriel. He no longer rolled his eyes every time the physical therapy started, and even though he tried to hide it, his breathing became more focused when he did the exercises. The man who had previously seemed to have given up on everything was starting to fight against himself. Valentina was leafing through a book while Gabriel watched the rain fall through the window. The silence between them was comfortable, until he suddenly said, "I didn't think I would still have anything to motivate me." She closed the book and looked at him. "What changed?" Gabriel was silent for a moment before answering. "I think you." Valentina felt her heart race, but she kept her composure. "It's not me, Gabriel. It's you. You're allowing yourself to try." He gave a weak, almost imperceptible smile. "Maybe, but you're the first person who made me believe that it's still worth it." Valentina looked away, feeling the weight of those words. What she didn't know was that, at that moment, Gabriel was starting to see her in a different way, and that would change everything. The days went by, and something in the Montero mansion changed. The house, previously cold and silent, began to show small signs of life. Gabriel, who had previously confined himself to the office or the bedroom, began to appear more often in the living room, on the balcony, and even in the kitchen, where he watched Valentina prepare coffee. But the biggest change came with the arrival of Miguel. That afternoon, Valentina had arranged to pick up her son from the neighbor's house, but Andre, the butler, suggested that the little one be brought to the mansion. "Mr. Montero has been in a better mood lately. I think Miguel's presence could do him good," commented Andre. Valentina hesitated, but ended up agreeing. And that was how Miguel entered the mansion, with his childish energy and his curious eyes exploring every corner of the house. "Mommy, this house is a castle," he exclaimed, delighted. Valentina smiled, but before she could answer, a dry voice echoed through the hallway. "It seems we have a new guest." Miguel turned quickly, staring at Gabriel, who was in his wheelchair, watching the scene with an unreadable expression. Valentina held her breath, waiting for him to complain. But, to her surprise, Miguel smiled and ran towards him. "Hi, are you my mother's boss?" Gabriel arched an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the direct approach. "Something like that," he replied, still trying to understand what was happening. "My name is Miguel. And yours?" There was a pause before Gabriel answered. "Gabriel." Miguel tilted his head. "Have you ever ridden a bike?" The businessman blinked, not knowing how to react. "A long time ago. So, when you get better, can you teach me? Mom said I'm terrible at it." The silence that followed was broken by a low laugh. Gabriel Montero was laughing. Valentina couldn't believe her eyes. For the first time, he looked human. Valentina and Gabriel were side by side, watching Miguel play in the garden. "Your son is smart," Gabriel commented. "He's a storm of energy," Valentina said, laughing. Gabriel was silent for a moment before saying, "I never thought I'd have children running around this house again." Valentina looked at him, confused. Again, he looked up at the stars, as if trying to find the courage to continue. "My brother had a son, a little boy named Daniel. He used to run around these gardens all the time." "What happened?" Gabriel took a deep breath before answering. "My brother died in a car accident 3 years ago. Daniel went to live with his mother in another country, and this house has never been the same." Valentina felt a tightness in her chest. Now she understood why Gabriel avoided contact with children so much. But Miguel had managed to do something that no one else had, awaken a part of Gabriel that he thought had been lost forever. She smiled, looking at him. "Maybe it's time to let this house have life again." Gabriel stared at her for a moment, and for the first time, he had nothing to say back. The days continued to pass, and Miguel's presence brought a new energy to the mansion. It was as if the house was breathing again. Little by little, Gabriel began to open up more. There were fewer complaints during his physical therapy sessions, and his silences were becoming less burdensome. But not everything would be so easy. That afternoon, while Valentina was helping Gabriel with a mobility exercise, a luxury car stopped in front of the mansion's gate. And out of it came Lorena. She was exactly as Gabriel remembered, elegant, impeccable, with the posture of someone who always knew what she wanted. But this time, she wanted something she no longer had. Gabriel was in the living room, talking to Miguel about a board game, when Andre hurried in. "Mr. Montero, there's someone here to see you." Gabriel arched an eyebrow. "Who?" Before Andre could answer, Lorena entered. The air in the room seemed to freeze. "Gabriel," her voice sounded melancholic, but her eyes carried that calculated glow that Valentina immediately recognized. The businessman remained silent for a long moment, his icy gaze fixed on her. What are you doing here? Lorena sighed, walking towards him as if she still had some intimacy. I heard you were getting better, and I realized that maybe I made a mistake. Valentina felt her whole body tense up. That could only be a joke. Gabriel, in turn, remained calm. A mistake? He laughed, but without humor. You abandoned me in the hospital, Lorena. You didn't even have the courage to wait for me to recover. She moved closer, placing her hand on the arm of his wheelchair. I was scared, Gabriel. I didn't know how to deal with everything. But now I see that I was selfish. We could try again. Valentina felt her stomach churn. It was unbelievable. Before Gabriel could answer, Miguel, who until then she watched in silence, frowned and tugged at the hem of Valentina's blouse. Mommy, does this girl want to take Mr. Gabriel away? Lorena looked at the boy, as if she had only just noticed his presence. And this is your son? Her expression changed, and Valentina felt the hidden contempt in her voice. Gabriel, who seemed about to answer, looked at Miguel and then at Valentina. And then he made the decision that would change everything. He held the boy's hand and looked directly at Lorena. Yes, he's part of my family now. The shock in Lorena's eyes was immediate. Family? You got to be kidding. But Gabriel just smiled. For the first time, he realized that he no longer felt anything for her. Valentina watched everything, speechless. She knew that this was the moment when the past finally stopped haunting him. And, more than ever, Gabriel Montero was ready to move on. Lorena was paralyzed. His face, once so confident, now reflected surprise and indignation. You have to be joking, Gabriel, he repeated, crossing his arms. But Gabriel wasn't. He looked at Miguel, who was still holding his hand, and then at Valentina. There was a certainty in his eyes that had never been there before. Joking. He let out a low laugh, but his gaze was firm. You no longer have a place in my life, Lorena. When I needed you, you left me. Now, I know that what really matters was not the past, but what I can build from now on. Lorena blinked, confused. She never imagined that he had really changed. Gabriel, she tried to argue, her voice full of false sweetness. I know I was wrong, but you can't deny that we had something special. Gabriel sighed, impatient. I can, and I'm denying it. The silence in the room was sharp. Miguel pulled Valentina's blouse, whispering, This girl doesn't like Mr. Gabriel, does she? Valentina didn't know whether to laugh or interrupt the situation. But Gabriel, upon hearing the boy's innocent observation, simply smiled. Lorena, realizing that she wouldn't get what she wanted, finally gave up. You're going to regret this, she said, irritated, before leaving, her heels clicking on the marble floor. When the door closed, Gabriel let out a long sigh and rested his head against the wheelchair. Finally, Valentina crossed her arms, watching him carefully. How do you feel? He gave a small smile, a genuine smile, like someone who's just gotten rid of a ghost. The sky was clear, and a light breeze passed through the mansion's gardens. Gabriel was sitting, thoughtful, when Valentina approached. I never imagined that day would come, he confessed, looking up at the stars. Which part? Getting rid of Lorena, or realizing that you can move on? Valentina asked, leaning against the railing. Gabriel chuckled softly. Both. She smiled and looked at him softly. You made the right choice, Gabriel. He turned his face to look at her. For the first time, his eyes no longer held the weight of the past. I think so. And for the first time, I feel like I'm not trapped anymore. He was no longer trapped in the past, and much less in his chair. There was a future right there in front of him, a future that began with a simple step, and he was ready to try. That morning, there was a different energy in the mansion. The sun was streaming in through the wide windows, bathing everything in a warm light, and the air seemed charged with expectation. Something important was about to happen. In the physical therapy room, Gabriel was sitting in the wheelchair, but his expression was different. He wasn't frustrated. He wasn't defeated. For the first time, he was determined. Valentina was by his side, as was Miguel, who watched everything with curious eyes. The physical therapist, Dr. Renato, was preparing the parallel supports. Today, Gabriel, I want us to try something new, the doctor said. Gabriel looked at him, interested. What? Renato smiled slightly. I want you to stand up. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Valentina felt her heart race, and Miguel squeezed her hand tightly. Gabriel, in turn, remained still, standing up. After so long, if you don't want to, we can. Wait a little longer, the physiotherapist said understandingly. But Gabriel shook his head. I want to. Valentina held her breath. He was ready. The physiotherapist adjusted the supports, and Valentina positioned herself next to him, ready to help him if he needed it. Gabriel took a deep breath. Focus on the moment, Renato said. Forget what's been through. Now it's up to you and your body. He closed his eyes for a moment and prepared himself for the greatest challenge of his life. Slowly, he held onto the parallel bars. He felt the muscles in his legs tremble. It was an effort that seemed impossible. But then, with a great push, Gabriel stood up. For a second, everything went silent. And then, he's standing up. She watched in silence, frowned, and tugged at the hem of Valentina's blouse. Mommy, does this girl want to take Mr. Gabriel away? Lorena looked at the boy, as if she had only just noticed his presence. And this is your son? Her expression changed, and Valentina felt the hidden contempt in her voice. Gabriel, who seemed about to answer, looked at Miguel and then at Valentina. And then he made the decision that would change everything. He held the boy's hand and looked directly at Lorena. Yes, he's part of my family now. The shock in Lorena's eyes was immediate. Family? You've got to be kidding. But Gabriel just smiled. For the first time, he realized that he no longer felt anything for her. Valentina watched everything, speechless. She knew that this was the moment when the past finally stopped haunting him. And, more than ever, Gabriel Montero was ready to move on. Lorena was paralyzed. His face, once so confident, now reflected surprise and indignation. You have to be joking, Gabriel, he repeated, crossing his arms. But Gabriel wasn't. He looked at Miguel, who was still holding his hand, and then at Valentina. There was a certainty in his eyes that had never been there before. Joking, he let out a low laugh, but his gaze was firm. You no longer have a place in my life, Lorena. When I needed you, you left me. Now, I know that what really matters was not the past, but what I can build from now on. Lorena blinked, confused. She never imagined that he had really changed. Gabriel, she tried to argue, her voice full of false sweetness. I know I was wrong, but you can't deny that we had something special. Gabriel sighed, impatient. I can, and I'm denying it. The silence in the room was sharp. Miguel pulled Valentina's blouse, whispering, This girl doesn't like Mr. Gabriel, does she? Valentina didn't know whether to laugh or interrupt the situation. But Gabriel, upon hearing the boy's innocent observation, simply smiled. Lorena, realizing that she wouldn't get what she wanted, finally gave up. You're going to regret this, she said, irritated, before leaving, her heels clicking on the marble floor. When the door closed, Gabriel let out a long sigh and rested his head against the wheelchair. Finally, Valentina crossed her arms, watching him carefully. How do you feel? He gave a small smile, a genuine smile, like someone who's just gotten rid of a ghost. The sky was clear, and a light breeze passed through the mansion's gardens. Gabriel was sitting, thoughtful, when Valentina approached. I never imagined that day would come, he confessed, looking up at the stars. Which part? Getting rid of Lorena, or realizing that you can move on? Valentina asked, leaning against the railing. Gabriel chuckled softly. Both. She smiled and looked at him softly. You made the right choice, Gabriel. He turned his face to look at her. For the first time, his eyes no longer held the weight of the past. I think so. And for the first time, I feel like I'm not trapped anymore. He was no longer trapped in the past, and much less in his chair. There was a future right there, in front of him. A future that began with a simple step. And he was ready to try. That morning, there was a different energy in the mansion. The sun was streaming in through the wide windows, bathing everything in a warm light, and the air seemed charged with expectation. Something important was about to happen. In the physical therapy room, Gabriel was sitting in the wheelchair, but his expression was different. He wasn't frustrated. He wasn't defeated. For the first time, he was determined. Valentina was by his side, as was Miguel, who watched everything with curious eyes. The physical therapist, Dr. Renato, was preparing the parallel supports. "Today, Gabriel, I want us to try something new," the doctor said. Gabriel looked at him, interested. "What?" Renato smiled slightly. "I want you to stand up." The silence that followed was almost palpable. Valentina felt her heart race, and Miguel squeezed her hand tightly. Gabriel, in turn, remained still, standing up. "After so long. If you don't want to, we can wait a little longer," the physiotherapist said understandingly. But Gabriel shook his head. "I want to." Valentina held her breath. He was ready. The physiotherapist adjusted the supports, and Valentina positioned herself next to him, ready to help him if he needed it. Gabriel took a deep breath. "Focus on the moment," Renato said. "Forget what's been through. Now it's up to you and your body." He closed his eyes for a moment and prepared himself for the greatest challenge of his life. Slowly, he held onto the parallel bars. He felt the muscles in his legs tremble. It was an effort that seemed impossible. But then, with a great push, Gabriel stood up. For a second, everything went silent. And then, he's standing up, Miguel shouted, jumping with joy. Valentina felt her eyes fill with tears. He was really standing up. Gabriel was breathing hard, his muscles trembling with effort, but the sparkle in his eyes was different. "I did it," he murmured, as if he couldn't believe it himself. And then he smiled. The first real smile in a long time. He had won. The silence in the physical therapy room was broken by the sound of Miguel's excited clapping, as he jumped with joy at seeing Gabriel finally standing up. "Mommy, he did it! He really did it!" the boy exclaimed, his eyes shining. Valentina put her hands to her mouth, trying to contain her emotion. She had always believed that this moment would come, but seeing it happen was indescribable. Gabriel, on the other hand, was motionless, feeling the strength of his own body for the first time in a long time. His legs were shaking, his muscles were aching, but he was standing up. He looked at Valentina, and she knew, without him having to say anything, that this was the greatest achievement of his life. "Now that you've managed to stand up, let's practice taking your first steps," the physiotherapist said with a satisfied smile. Gabriel nodded, but his attention was on Valentina. She helped him sit back down in the chair, and for a moment their eyes met. Something deep passed between them, a feeling that had been there for some time, but that was now impossible to ignore. The sky was orange with the sunset when Valentina found Gabriel sitting on one of the garden benches, watching Miguel run among the flowers. She sat down next to him, and for a few moments neither of them said anything. That comfortable silence was proof that something between them had changed. "I wouldn't have made it without you," he said, breaking the silence. Valentina smiled, looking at him. "Of course I would have. I was just here to remind you that you were still capable." Gabriel turned his face to look at her. "You don't understand, Valentina." He took a deep breath. "Ever since the accident, I believed my life was over. But you showed me that I could still start over." She felt her heart race, but before she could answer, Gabriel grabbed her hand. "I know I'm not the easiest man in the world," he hesitated, trying to find the right words. "But I want to try to be the man you deserve." Valentina blinked in surprise. "Gabriel, I don't just want to start my life over." He squeezed her hand lightly. "I want to start over with you." Valentina's heart raced. She never expected to hear that. But deep down she knew she wanted that too. Before she could answer, Miguel ran over to them and threw himself into Valentina's lap. "Mommy, when Mr. Gabriel is walking properly, can he play tag with me?" Valentina and Gabriel looked at each other and laughed. "Let's see who wins, little boy," Gabriel said, ruffling the boy's hair. And in that moment, Valentina knew Gabriel wasn't just walking again. He was finally living again. And the future he had feared so much now seemed brighter than ever. Together, they were ready for a new beginning.